4 rusted washers, a brass button polished smooth with age, a bent fishing lure, and Sarah Miller's silver sewing thimble. Ben Miller's hands froze over the grease-stained workbench. The thimble sat in the middle of the pile, catching a thin shaft of afternoon sunlight that slipped through the dusty windows of the machine shop. He picked it up with trembling fingers, turning it over until he found the tiny scratch along its rim, a mark he'd accidentally made years earlier while repairing a broken lantern. There was no mistake. It belonged to his wife. His gaze slowly lifted to his 12-year-old daughter. Clara stood quietly beside the doorway, brushing pine needles from the knees of her faded blue jeans. Around her waist hung an oversized canvas tool belt, one of Ben's old belts that she'd punched extra holes into so it wouldn't slide off her narrow hips. She didn't look frightened. She simply looked tired. "Where did you get this?" Ben asked, holding up the thimble. Clara hesitated. "The crows brought it." Silence settled over the workshop. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of the old windmill echoed across the Miller farm, while a tractor hummed somewhere beyond the wheat fields. Ben waited for her to smile. She didn't. Instead, she carefully placed another rusted washer onto the bench, as though arranging pieces of a puzzle. "They've been bringing me things for 3 weeks. Ben rubbed the bridge of his nose. Ever since Sarah died the previous winter after a long battle with cancer, Clara had changed. She still helped feed the chickens before sunrise. She still completed her school lessons at the kitchen table. She still laughed whenever the farm dog chased rabbits across the pasture. But there were long stretches when she'd disappear into the pine grove behind the abandoned grain silo, carrying a canvas sack over one shoulder. People had started noticing, and in a town as small as Oakhaven, people always talked. The Grahams had seen her sitting beneath the trees with dozens of black birds surrounding her. Mrs. Collins from the church claimed Clara whispered to them. Some of the neighborhood boys had already given her a nickname, Crow Girl. Ben hated hearing it. "You've been spending too much time alone," he said gently. "They're just birds." Clara looked out the window toward the ridge. "They're not just birds." Ben sighed. "And where did you get enough money to buy that huge sack of peanuts I saw in the truck?" She lowered her eyes. "I traded Grandpa's silver dollar." Ben stared. "The one he gave you on your 10th birthday." She nodded once. "You traded a family heirloom. For bird food?" They needed it. Before Ben could ask another question, Clara picked up her bucket and quietly walked out the screen door. The old latch clicked shut behind her. Ben remained standing in the silent workshop, Sarah's silver thimble resting in his palm. There was only one problem. He had buried that thimble beneath the old apple tree the week after Sarah's funeral. No one had known, not even Clara. If stories about family, faith, and unexpected miracles still have a place in your heart, take a moment to subscribe and join us each week. And before we continue, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? We'd love to know. Ben followed at a distance. Late September had begun painting the valley in gold and amber. The wheat fields shimmered beneath a cool breeze, and the smell of damp earth drifted across the farm. Clara walked past the chicken coop, past the cattle pasture where 3 Black Angus cows grazed lazily, past the old windmill. She headed straight for the pine grove behind the abandoned grain silo, the place everyone else avoided. The concrete foundation had cracked decades ago, and young saplings now pushed through broken slabs. Rusted farm machinery lay half-hidden beneath blackberry vines. As Clara stepped beneath the pines, a harsh caw echoed overhead, then another. Black shapes appeared between the branches. 1, 5, 10. More than 30 American crows glided silently from the trees and settled around her in a loose circle. Ben instinctively ducked behind an old cedar stump. He had spent his whole life farming. He knew crows. They scattered long before people got close. These didn't. They simply watched Clara, patiently, waiting. She reached into her canvas sack and carefully placed whole peanuts across an old tree stump, leaving small spaces between each one. The largest crow landed first. Its feathers shimmered with deep blue highlights beneath the afternoon sun. Instead of rushing toward the food, it tilted its head and looked directly into Clara's eyes. Then, it picked up one peanut. Only after it stepped away did the others begin eating. They remember manners. Clara whispered softly. Ben blinked. She wasn't talking to herself. She was talking to him. You knew I was here. She smiled without turning around. They told me. Ben almost laughed. The birds told you? They always know when someone's watching. The largest crow hopped closer to Clara before dropping something at her boots. It was an old brass pocket watch chain. Clara picked it up and slipped it into her canvas pouch. Another crow landed. This one left behind a smooth piece of green river glass. A third delivered a rusted bolt. Ben watched in stunned silence. They weren't stealing the peanuts and flying away. They were exchanging gifts, one after another, almost politely. When the last peanut disappeared, the flock lifted together into the sky, circling once, before disappearing beyond the western ridge. Ben walked toward his daughter. How long? 23 days. And they've been bringing you things every day. She nodded. They're getting better. Better? They're learning what shines. That evening, the strange collection spread across the kitchen table. Washers, old coins, fishing lures, buttons, tiny brass hinges, colorful marbles, river glass, pocket watch chains, even a child's silver bracelet missing its clasp. Ben turned each object over carefully. They're all worthless. Most of them. What do you mean? Clara lifted Sarah's silver thimble. This wasn't. Ben looked at her. I didn't tell them to find treasure. You told them? I showed them. She opened a notebook. Inside were dozens of neat sketches. Old keys, coins, metal buckles, silver jewelry, brass rings. Every page carefully labeled. I wanted them to understand what I was looking for. Ben stared. You taught wild crows? They're smarter than people think. The next morning, Ben drove up the ridge to visit Thomas Abernathy. The retired wildlife warden listened quietly while scraping old wax from one of his beehives. When Ben finished, Thomas finally nodded. Your daughter isn't imagining things. You've seen this before? Not exactly. Thomas smiled faintly. But crows remember faces for years. They teach their young. They solve puzzles. And sometimes, he looked toward the valley, they form partnerships. Partnerships. Feed them fairly. Never frighten them. Keep your promises. They often return the favor. Ben frowned. By bringing junk. Thomas chuckled. Not junk. Gifts. They don't understand value the way we do. They bring what catches their eye. Thomas stood slowly and brushed the wax from his hands. The interesting question isn't why they're bringing Clara gifts. It's why they suddenly started searching so hard. Ben drove home with those words echoing in his mind. As he rounded the final bend toward the farm, he slowed. 3 boys stood beside the mailbox. One cupped his hands around his mouth. Hey, Crow Girl. The others laughed. High above them, nearly 40 black birds sat silently along the Miller fence line, watching. Not one moved. Ben noticed something strange. Neither did the boys. As Clara stepped onto the porch carrying her bucket of peanuts, every crow lifted from the fence at exactly the same moment and followed her toward the pine grove. The laughter faded. For the first time, the boys simply stood there, watching the impossible unfold. Word spread through Oakhaven faster than the first frost. By Sunday morning, half the congregation at the Little White Church had heard about the girl with the crow army. Some chuckled. Others shook their heads with quiet sympathy. After the service, Ben overheard 2 men standing beside the hitching rail. Poor kid never got over losing her mama. I hear she spends hours talking to birds. Ben ought to stop it before it gets worse. Ben kept walking, pretending not to hear, but every word followed him home. The crows kept coming. Every afternoon, just after 3 o'clock, they gathered beneath the pines as though answering an invisible bell, and every afternoon they left something behind. One day it was a tarnished silver spoon. The next, an antique compass with a cracked glass face. Then came an old brass padlock, a child's marble, a pocket knife with no blade, an old sheriff's badge so worn its lettering had almost disappeared. Ben began lining everything across the shelves inside the machine shop. What if someone comes looking for this stuff? He asked. Clara smiled. Then we'll give it back. You'd really do that? It was never ours. Ben couldn't argue with that. Then one chilly October afternoon, The largest crow arrived carrying something different. Instead of dropping it on the feeding stump, the bird landed directly in front of Clara. It opened its beak. A silver necklace fell onto the wood. Ben's breath caught. A tiny oak leaf pendant hung from the delicate chain. Sarah's necklace. She had worn it almost every day. The necklace had disappeared months before she died. They had searched the farmhouse from attic to cellar. Neither of them had ever found it. Ben slowly picked it up. His thumb brushed across the tiny engraving on the back. A gift he'd given Sarah on their 10th anniversary. He looked at Clara. They found it. She nodded. I think they remembered seeing her wear it. Ben looked toward the flock gathered in the trees. For the first time, he didn't see pests. He saw witnesses. That evening, he sat on the porch long after sunset. Clara carried 2 steaming mugs of tea outside. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Ben broke the silence. I owe you an apology. She looked at him. I thought you were hiding from your grief. I was wrong. Clara smiled faintly. I wasn't hiding. I was hoping. Hoping for what? That they'd find the last thing Mom couldn't. Ben turned toward her. The last thing? Clara nodded. A week before she went into the hospital, Mom told me she'd been searching for something Grandpa left behind. Ben frowned. She never told me that. She wanted to. Clara's voice softened. She kept saying she'd explain everything after harvest. Her eyes drifted toward the fading sunset. She thought she'd have more time. Ben lowered his head. For months, he'd wondered why Sarah had seemed distracted during her final autumn. Now the answer finally made sense. The following afternoon, Ben asked Clara the question that had been bothering him for weeks. How did you teach them what to look for? She carried out a small wooden box. Inside were ordinary objects, old keys, brass rings, metal washers, pocket watches bought cheaply at flea markets. She smiled. I'd show them one. They'd look at it. Then I'd hide it under leaves. They learned to find it. When they brought it back, I gave them peanuts. You trained them. I made it a game. Ben laughed softly. That's exactly what your grandfather would have done. 3 weeks later, something changed. The gifts stopped. For 2 straight days, the birds arrived empty-beaked. They still accepted peanuts, but after eating, they flew west toward the abandoned limestone quarry. Every single one. Again the next day, and the next. Clara noticed before Ben did. They're searching somewhere. Searching for what? I don't know, but they keep going back. Meanwhile, trouble was brewing. Silas Graham parked his pickup beside the Miller workshop one cold morning. I figured you ought to hear it from me. Ben wiped grease from his hands. Hear what? The county finally settled that old boundary dispute. Silas unfolded a survey map. They're clearing the brush around the western quarry next week. Ben studied the paper. The old quarry marked the edge of both properties. Why clear it? Survey crews need access. Silas shrugged. Everything growing along those cliffs is coming down. Clara, standing nearby, suddenly turned pale. When? Monday. She looked toward the western ridge. They don't have much time. Silas frowned. Who? She didn't answer. The next 3 afternoons felt different. The crows barely touched their peanuts. Instead, they flew almost immediately toward the quarry. Even Corvus seemed restless. The great bird circled high above the cliffs before disappearing into the dense blackberry thickets growing below the limestone ledges. Every evening he returned exhausted. His feathers were dusty, sometimes scratched. Once Ben noticed dried mud clinging to one foot. Whatever the birds were doing, they were working. Saturday arrived beneath dark clouds. Cold rain swept across the valley, the kind that soaked through jackets within minutes. Ben assumed the birds would stay hidden. Instead, dozens of black shapes appeared over the farmhouse, circling, calling, again and again. Clara stepped onto the porch. They want us to follow. Ben looked toward the storm. In this weather, Corvus landed on the fence post. He wasn't carrying treasure, only a rusted iron ring tangled in a strip of rotted canvas. The crow dropped it at Clara's feet. She knelt, lifting the damp cloth carefully. Faded letters were still visible. Her eyes widened. Dad. She looked toward the quarry. They found the bank bag. Corvus let out a sharp call, then flew west. The rest of the flock followed immediately. Ben stared at the torn canvas. His heart began pounding. For the first time, he realized the crows weren't bringing gifts anymore. They were trying to lead them somewhere. Silas had planned to bring the bulldozer Monday morning. If whatever the birds had found disappeared beneath clearing equipment, it might be lost forever. Ben grabbed the truck keys. "We're going." Clara was already pulling on her raincoat. Outside, the flock wheeled through the gray sky, like a living compass, waiting for the Millers to catch up. Rain hammered the windshield as Ben's old pickup climbed the muddy track toward the abandoned limestone quarry. Above them, the flock stayed together. Nearly 40 crows circled against the dark sky, never straying far from the truck. Every few hundred yards, Corvus dipped lower, as if checking that the Millers were still following. When they reached the quarry entrance, the birds suddenly scattered, not in panic, with purpose, half settled along the limestone ledges. The rest perched in the tops of wind-bent cedars, overlooking a dense patch of blackberry briars near the base of the cliff. Corvus landed first. Instead of flying away, he hopped into the middle of the thicket and began pecking furiously at the ground. Again and again. Then he flew out, circled once, and returned to the exact same spot. "Dad," Clara whispered. "He's showing us." Before Ben could answer, another pickup rumbled onto the ridge. Silas Graham climbed out, followed by his teenage son. "I figured I'd find you two up here," Silas called over the rain. Ben held up the strip of rotted canvas. "We think the birds found something." Silas studied the faded bank lettering, then looked at the flock. Every crow was staring toward the same blackberry patch. Not one bird moved. Silas scratched his chin. "I've farmed this valley for 50 years. I've never seen anything like this." He looked back at his truck. Well, standing around won't solve the mystery. He walked to the bed of the pickup, pulled out a logging chain and a pair of loppers, then tossed one set to Ben. "Let's see what your feathered friends are trying so hard to show us." The briars fought them every inch. Thick vines wrapped around their boots. Sharp thorns tore through gloves and jackets. Rain turned the slope into slick clay. After nearly an hour of cutting and pulling, Silas hooked the largest tangle to his truck and eased forward. The roots groaned. The earth shifted. Then, with a loud crack, the entire blackberry patch peeled away from the hillside. Something round and rusted appeared beneath it, an iron ring, half buried in the mud. Ben knelt beside it. His fingers trembled as he cleared away years of packed dirt. The ring was bolted to a heavy wooden lid. "A trap door," he whispered. Silas stared. "I've hunted this ridge my whole life. I never knew this was here." Together they pulled. The swollen wood resisted. Then, with one final heave, the hatch broke free. A cool breath of air drifted from the darkness below. Stone steps disappeared into an old storage chamber, carved into the limestone, decades earlier. Ben switched on his flashlight. The beam swept across broken shelves, rusted farm tools, and finally, a weathered canvas bank bag resting in the corner. The bag was stained with age but still intact. Beside it lay a rusted metal cash box. Ben carefully lifted the canvas bag. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth, were hundreds of gleaming silver Morgan dollars. The cash box held brittle property records, handwritten family letters, and the original deed to the eastern 40 acres of the Miller farm. Documents everyone believed had been destroyed in the courthouse fire years earlier. For a long moment, no one spoke. Rain pattered softly outside the hidden chamber. Silas removed his cap. He looked at Clara. "I owe you an apology." His voice was quiet. "I thought you were chasing a foolish dream." He smiled. "Turns out, I was the fool." News traveled through Oakhaven before sunset. By the following week, people lined up outside the Miller farm hoping to see the famous crows for themselves. Some came out of curiosity. Others came to apologize. Mrs. Collins brought Clara a fresh apple pie. The boys who had mocked her stood awkwardly by the mailbox. One finally stepped forward. "We're sorry we called you Crow Girl." Clara smiled. "I never minded." "You didn't?" She shook her head. "Crows don't care what people call them." The boys laughed. This time, Clara laughed with them. Life slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm. The hidden savings helped Ben repair the machine shop, replace worn-out equipment, and finally restore the neglected eastern fields that Sarah had loved so much. But one thing never changed. Every afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock, the air compressor fell silent. Ben carried 2 mugs of hot tea onto the porch. Clara filled the cedar feeding platform with peanuts, walnuts, almonds, and dried mealworms. Soon, black wings appeared above the pine grove. The flock arrived just as faithfully as the sunrise. Sometimes they brought polished stones, sometimes colorful marbles, sometimes bits of river glass that sparkled like tiny jewels in the afternoon sun. If an item looked as though it belonged to someone, Clara carefully set it aside until its owner could be found. Most were eventually returned. A few remained on a shelf inside the workshop, a quiet reminder that kindness has a way of finding its way home. One spring afternoon, nearly a year after everything had happened, Corvus landed alone on the feeding platform. He placed something gently beside Clara's hand. It was a worn silver dollar, the very one she had traded months before to buy her first sack of peanuts. Clara stared at it in disbelief. Ben smiled. "I guess," he said softly. "They've been looking for you, too." Corvus gave a single satisfied caw before lifting into the bright blue sky. The rest of the flock followed, their wings flashing in the sunlight as they disappeared over the western ridge. Ben slipped an arm around his daughter. Some people would always say the birds were only following instinct. Others would call it coincidence. But everyone in Oakhaven agreed on one thing. They had doubted a little girl who chose kindness over ridicule, and because she believed in something the rest of the town couldn't yet see. An old family treasure was found. A promise Sarah never had the chance to keep was finally fulfilled, and a valley learned that even the smallest acts of compassion can echo farther than anyone imagines. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear about a moment when kindness came back to you in an unexpected way. And if you enjoy stories of family, resilience, and the quiet wonders hidden in the countryside, don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, keep looking for the extraordinary in the ordinary. You never know what might be waiting just beyond the trees.